The wind had been gnawing at the barn walls all night, when I heard it not the sharp stamp of a horse or the skitter of a rat, but something slower, heavier, trying to hide in the dark. Lantern in hand, I pushed open the door, the hinges groaning like they hadn't been moved in years. The smell inside was thick with hay and manure, but under it came something else, blood and sweat, faint but sharp. My eyes caught on a shape in the far stall, curled low in the hay. At first I thought it was a child, small and still. But when she shifted, the lamplight showed a woman's face, bruised and dirt-streaked, black hair tangled across her cheek. She didn't speak, didn't move to rise. I set the lantern down slow and walked back out into the cold night without a word. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever faced a moment when one choice could change the rest of your life. My name's Luke Carver. I've been keeping to myself on this patch of Arizona territory for near 5 years now. On land too dry for much, but mule feed and stubborn men. I came here after the war, carrying a saber scar under my ribs and the weight of burying my wife and boy. The winter fever swept through New Mexico. Since then, I've worked the days in silence, sunup to sundown, patching fence, hauling water from the creek, tending the stock, and speaking to no one unless I had to. I wasn't built for town talk or church socials anymore. I kept the Sabbath in my own way, fixing nothing more than a simple meal and watching the sun sink past the butte. The country out here doesn't give much for free. Neighbors are scarce, and the ones close enough to matter keep their dealings quick. My own father raised me on a small homestead in Missouri, where work came before comfort, and a man's word was worth more than paper. We bartered more than we bought, wore our boots until the soles peeled, and saved new clothes for Sunday service. That way of life stayed with me, so when I came west, I brought the same habits: coffee strong enough to chew tools sharpened before dawn, and never owing $1 I couldn't pay. But Arizona was changing. The railroad brought in men with money in their pockets and eyes on the land. Prices climbed in town. Speculators bought up pasture, and some folks who'd worked their claims for 20 years found themselves pushed out with nothing but a paper notice. Law didn't always side with the man who'd put in the sweat. I'd seen it happen more than once, and every time it left a taste in my mouth like metal. Out here you learned quick that trouble could ride in wearing a badge or a suit, and either way, it meant the same. That night after I found her in the barn, I sat by the stove with my coffee cooling in my hands, listening for any sound but the wind. I didn't know her name yet. Didn't know who she was running from. But I knew the look in her eyes, the kind of look that said she'd already decided no one was going to help her. When I rose the next morning, I took a tin of water to the barn, set it by her without a word, and walked away. By evening, the door to my house eased open, and there she was, wearing one of my old shirts, her torn dress bundled in her arms. I stepped aside to let her in. That was the first door she'd walked through in a long while. And it was the last quiet night before the riders came. By morning, the wind had dropped enough for the sun to lay thin lines of gold across the floorboards. I'd already been up for an hour, boiling coffee and checking the corral before I stepped back into the barn. She was still there, curled near the wall, where the hay piled thick, her arm drawn tight across her chest like she was holding herself together. Her eyes opened as I set a tin cup of water on the plank beside her head. They were dark and watchful, not pleading, not soft, weighing me like a man at the other end of a poker table. "Water's clean," I said, my voice low from disuse. "You need it." She didn't move, only watched. I left her to it and walked back into the light. That evening, she was gone from the barn. My first thought was she'd limped into the desert and collapsed somewhere, and I cursed under my breath. I followed the dry bed of the creek until I saw her kneeling in the shallows, stripped to the waist, washing the dirt from her skin. The water caught in her hair, turning it black as pitch, her back marked by scratches from brush and bramble. She turned slightly when she heard me on the bank. We locked eyes for a moment, but she didn't cover herself or look away. I nodded once and walked back, leaving her the creek. It was near dark when the door to my house opened. She stepped inside with damp hair and bare feet, my old work shirt hanging on her frame, the sleeves rolled high and the buttons uneven. Her torn buckskin dress was bundled in her arms, wet and past saving. I didn't ask questions, only moved aside. I poured her a bowl of stew, set it on the table, and sat across from her. We ate without words, her gaze never shifting from my face. When she was done, I went to the old trunk and pulled out a quilt. "Floor's better than dirt," I said, holding it out. "Ain't much, but it's yours for now." She hesitated, then took it and settled near the hearth, not close enough to touch, but not hiding either. The next morning, she joined me at the table, cradling a cup of coffee in her hands. Her fingernails were cracked, the knuckles scraped raw, and a faint bruise ringed her forearm. "You from around here?" I asked. She stared at the steam for a long moment before nodding. "Your name?" Her answer was barely more than a breath, Nayeli. I gave her mine, and that was all. After breakfast, I told her she could stay if she wanted, but I'd need help with the work. She didn't answer then, but by noon, I saw her out by the trough, dragging brush away, with her good ankle braced and her bad one turned to the side. She moved slow, careful, but didn't stop until the space was clear. Later in the kitchen, I asked where she'd been headed. "Nowhere," she said, voice flat. I waited. I ran. I asked if she'd killed the men who came after her. She shook her head. "Cut one, ran from the rest." I asked if she thought they were still looking. She shrugged. I told her plain if they showed up, I'd handle it. That made her eyes narrow, like she was testing the weight of my words. "You fight for me?" she asked. "I don't turn people out," I told her. "Not after they bled in my barn." She stared at me long enough for the silence to stretch, then turned back to the pot on the stove. That night I brought her another blanket. When our hands met, she didn't pull away. It wasn't trust, not yet, but the edge between us had shifted. I checked the doors and windows before turning in, set my rifle within reach, and lay listening to her steady breathing by the fire. Just before dawn, something stirred in my gut, the old scout sense from the war, when the air would change a beat before trouble showed. I moved to the window. In the pale half-light, fresh hoof prints cut across the yard, two sets riding close together. She was already in the kitchen, hair tied back with a strip of cloth, her hand gripping the table edge. I told her riders had passed through. She didn't blink. "Looking?" she asked. I nodded. Not long after, the sound of hooves carried from the road. One rider. I stepped out onto the porch. As he came into view, Aaron Tull, the county deputy. His coat was too clean for a man claiming hard travel, and the set of his mouth was that of someone looking for a reason to use his badge. He reined up at my fence and tipped his hat without warmth. "Got word a couple of Apaches were headed west. One hurt. Blood trail ran toward your side." I told him I'd seen coyote tracks, nothing more. His smile went thin. "Mind if I take a look in your barn?" "No," I said. Not an explanation, just the word. His eyes narrowed. "You hiding something?" Before I could answer, the door behind me eased open. Nayeli didn't step out, but I knew he'd seen her shadow move. His tone changed. "You know what happens if someone's harboring a fugitive? Even an Apache?" I told him she wasn't a fugitive. "That's all it takes," he said. Then he leaned forward in the saddle voice, low and mean. "You planning on laying with her too?" I walked up slow to his horse, took the reins near the bit, and met his eyes. "She's under my roof. You say one more word like that, and I'll drag you back to town with your tongue stuffed down your throat." We stared each other down until I let go. He pulled back a few paces, all false calm, and muttered, "This ain't done." He turned his horse and rode off the dust, hanging in the still air long after he was gone. Inside, Nayeli stood with her arms crossed. I told her he'd seen her and asked if she wanted to leave. "If I leave, he'll follow," she said. I told her to stay and we'd handle what came. She stepped closer than before, her voice steady. "You fight for me." I met her eyes. "If I have to." She held my gaze a moment longer, then let her shoulders ease like the decision had been made. That night, she didn't bed down by the hearth. She stood in my doorway without speaking. I slid over, and she lay beside me. Her body was warm against mine, and in the quiet, the weight of the day slipped just enough for both of us to sleep. Morning broke warm, the air carrying the faint scent of mesquite from the south. Nayeli was still in my bed when I opened my eyes, her back turned to the light filtering through the shutters. She hadn't slipped away in the night or curled into herself like before. Her hand rested against my ribs, loose and unguarded. I stayed still, letting her wake on her own. When she rolled to face me, her eyes met mine without the sharp edge I'd grown used to. She brushed her fingertips along the scar under my ribs, tracing it once before asking where it came from. "Saber blade," I told her. "Cold Harbor, 64. She nodded, her thumb pressing lightly against the seam in my skin, and said nothing more. We rose without another word. She wrapped herself in my blanket to fetch her shirt from the chair, pulling it on without turning away like she once had. Over coffee, she asked if I'd always lived like the world had already ended. I told her I'd lived through the part that felt like it did. She didn't push for more. The silence between us had changed, no longer the wary kind, but the sort that settled easy when two people understood enough not to fill it. That afternoon, she came with me to the south fence. The line had sagged where the cedar posts had shifted in the dry ground. She didn't wait for me to ask, just picked up a pair of pliers and fell in step. Her limp was still there, but she worked through it, holding the wire taut while I drove in the staples. Once the wire snapped loose and lashed her palm. She hissed, but didn't drop it. I caught her wrist and turned her hand over to check the cut. It was shallow, but bleeding well. She started to pull away, then stopped, watching my face as I cleaned the scrape and wrapped it with a strip of cloth. "You touch gentle," she said quietly. "Most men don't." I met her gaze. "I'm not most." She asked if I was afraid of her. "No," I said. Her eyes didn't leave mine. "I was," she admitted. "Now I don't know what I feel." By sundown, the posts were firm and the wire drawn tight. She went inside ahead of me and came back out with a tin plate, half a biscuit on it, rough-shaped and a little burned. "I tried," she said. I took a bite. "Best biscuit I've had this week." She smirked. "It's Wednesday." I laughed, a small sound, but the first that had felt natural in a long time. That night we lay close under the same blanket. The air was warm, the wind still. She rested her hand on my chest, her leg over mine. Her eyes searched mine once before she leaned in. "Are you sure?" I asked. She didn't look away. "Yes." We moved slow, careful, not because of fear, but because there was no need to hurry. When it was done, we stayed close, her head on my shoulder, both of us drifting into real sleep for the first time in years. The next day brought a dry wind out of the east. I saddled the bay mare after breakfast. Nayeli stood in the doorway, hair damp from the creek, my shirt hanging loose over her shoulders. "Going to town?" she asked. I nodded. "Flour, salt, maybe more bandage wrap." She didn't tell me to stay, but her eyes followed as I rode out. Dry Bend sat 15 miles east, one street lined with 2 saloons, a mercantile, and more guns than the place needed. I kept my trips short and my head down. That morning was no different until I stepped out of the store with my supplies and found 2 men crossing the street toward me. Clyde Mercer led a big man with a belly under his gun belt and a way of walking like he owned the dirt under his boots. The other was younger, jumpy, his hand never far from his holster. Carver Clyde called his mouth curling. I kept walking. Still playing house with that squaw? The younger one chuckled under his breath. Word is she's warming your bed. Maybe we'll try our luck next time you're gone. I stopped and turned to face them. You've got 10 seconds to walk the other way. Clyde grinned. Or what? You going to shoot us in the back, like you did those Rebs? I stepped in close enough to smell the tobacco on his breath. I buried my wife and son before I ever laid a hand on another woman. If you or anyone else comes near my land again, I'll bury you too. His grin faltered. He spat in the dust at my feet. Careful, Carver. You ain't got law out there, just dirt. And dirt's got memory. I didn't answer, just turned and mounted up. By the time I reached the ridge above the creek, I saw her standing by the gate watching me ride in. She took the flower from my hands without a word, then looked toward the hill. I heard them, she said. I frowned. What men? She pointed toward the ridge. 2 of them. They left when you got close? I told her she should have stayed near the house. She shook her head. I don't stay anymore. That night I sat on the porch with my rifle across my lap watching the road. I didn't think they'd come yet. But men who talked like that often wanted to prove something. The boards under my chair creaked when Nieli stepped out barefoot and wrapped in a blanket. You should rest, she said. I shook my head. She stood beside me for a while in the stillness. You fight them before they fight you, she asked. No, I said. But I won't let them decide what happens on my land. She nodded and sat beside me, her hand finding mine under the blanket. The next day, we worked like we were expecting company. I built a second gate at the far end of the property, reinforced the barn doors, and moved supplies inside. Nieli gathered stones into a pile near the hill, something to light fast if she needed to signal me. I showed her how to hold and fire the rifle. She hit the bottle on her second try. Good, I said. She lowered the barrel, her eyes steady. They don't scare me. I told her they should fear just meant she was thinking straight. She looked at me for a long moment. I thought I was dead when I crawled into that barn. I nodded. I thought I was finished too. That night the air stilled. The horses shifted in the corral restless for no reason they could see. The kind of quiet settled in that I knew well the one before trouble showed. The stillness held through the early morning, the kind where even the birds keep quiet. I checked the corral, feeling the weight of the air, and found Nieli already outside sitting on the porch with a strip of leather in her hands. She was binding it tight around her ankle, though her eyes stayed fixed on the far ridge. They're coming today, she said. I didn't ask how she knew. I only nodded. We spent the next hours without much talk, each moving with purpose. I checked the gates and walked the fence lines one last time, making sure the posts would hold if pushed. She stayed near the barn, sorting through the supplies we'd moved inside the day before. When I came back, she was seated at the table, my rifle laid out before her. The stock had been oiled, the barrel cleaned, a neat row of cartridges beside it. She looked up as I stepped in. Easier to fire if it's ready, she said. By noon, the sound of hooves broke the heat. 3 riders moved into view, their dust cloud hanging low in the still air. Clyde Mercer led his bulk, filling the saddle, the younger hand Roy Cutter just behind, eyes darting like a colt's. Aaron Tull rode third, his badge catching the sun. They reined in at the gate but didn't dismount. Tull called across the space. Carver, you've got one last chance to turn her over. I stepped out from the porch, rifle in hand, but pointed down. She's under my roof, I said. She's Apache. He shot back, and she's wanted. I shook my head. She's done nothing wrong. Tull's mouth twisted. Town doesn't want her here. I'm not in town, I answered. Roy shifted in his saddle hand, brushing his holster. I lifted the rifle just enough to make the point. Don't I said? Tull's gaze flicked to Nieli as she stepped down from the porch. She stopped beside me, her chin high, eyes hard. "You want to take me?" she called out. "Try." The words hung in the hot air. Roy looked to Clyde, uncertain. Nieli took another step forward. "I've bled, I've run, and I've buried more than you'll ever know. If I fall, I'll take someone with me." Clyde's jaw worked, but no sound came out. I looked straight at Tull. "You fire here, and you'll have to explain to a judge why a badge turned into a noose." Tull's face tightened. "You think the law cares about her?" "No," I said. "That's why I care." Silence stretched. Finally, Roy muttered, "This ain't worth it." Tull's eyes burned, but he didn't argue. Clyde shifted in his saddle, then pulled his horse around. One by one, they turned back the way they'd come, the dust rising behind them, until the road was empty again. We stood there until the last trace of them was gone. Nieli's shoulders eased, but her voice stayed steady. "They'll be back. Or worse will." I nodded. "I know, but now they know we won't run." She looked at me. "You didn't do that for justice." "No," I said. "I did it for you." Her arms went around my waist, her head against my chest. I held her there, the sound of her breath, the only thing breaking the quiet. That night, we didn't light a lamp. We sat close by the fire, our knees touching her hands, folded over mine. The warmth between us wasn't cautious anymore. It was claimed, the choice already made on both sides. The wind picked up after dark, brushing over the roof with a low sigh. Somewhere in that sound, I knew the stillness wouldn't last, and the next move would be ours to make. The next days came warm and still, the dust hanging in the air long after the wind had gone. We worked through it, patching the lean-to roof, tightening the hinges on the barn doors. But I kept my rifle close. Nieli moved about the place like she belonged there now, no longer asking what she could do, just doing it. She fetched water from the creek, stacked kindling by the door, and sorted the stores we'd pulled in from the sheds. The tightness in her shoulders had eased, though her eyes still lifted toward the ridge every time the light shifted. I knew the quiet wouldn't last. On the third morning, I saddled the bay after breakfast. "Going to town," I told her. "Need nails lamp oil and more flour." She didn't tell me not to go, but she followed me to the gate. "You think they'll be there?" she asked. "Maybe," I said. "Won't matter." She stepped back as I rode out, but I felt her watching until I turned east toward Dry Bend. The main street was busy with wagons and riders when I arrived. I kept my hat brim low, taking care of my purchases quick. But trouble didn't wait for an invitation. Clyde Mercer was leaning against the post outside the saloon when I stepped out of the mercantile. Roy Cutter stood with him, that restless twitch still in his hands. Clyde's voice carried. "Carver. Thought you'd be laying low after your show the other day." I kept walking. "Town's been talking," Roy said. "About you and your Apache." I stopped and faced them. Clyde's smirk deepened. "Word is, she's got fire. Maybe we'll see it up close next time you're gone." My hand rested on the bag at my side. "If either of you comes near my land, you won't come back," I said. Clyde stepped forward close enough I could smell the whiskey on his breath. "You got no law out there, Carver. Just dirt. And dirt don't talk." I looked him square in the eyes. "It won't have to." They didn't follow me out of town, but I didn't ride easy. I cut back along the ridge instead of the road, keeping high where I could see the lowlands. That's when I spotted the pair of riders below, just far enough to keep clear of my land, but close enough to watch. They turned away when they saw me heading in. Nieli was by the gate when I rode in. She took the sack from my hand before I'd swung down. "I saw them," she said. "Two men from up by the creek. Left when you got close." I told her she should have stayed near the house. She shook her head. "I don't hide anymore." That evening I sat on the porch with the rifle across my lap. The road was empty, but I watched it all the same. Nieli came out barefoot, wrapped in a shawl. She stood beside me without speaking for a time. Then she said, "You fight them before they fight you." "No," I answered, "but I'll choose where it happens." She nodded once and sat beside me, her hand brushing mine under the fabric. At first light, we prepared like we were expecting company. I built a second gate at the far fence line, set heavier crossbars on the barn doors, and shifted the horses to the corral nearest the house. Nieli hauled stones to a pile at the rise above the creek. "Something to burn if I need to call you back quick," she explained. I handed her the rifle and showed her how to set her stance. The first shot missed, but the second struck the bottle square. Her jaw set firm. "They don't scare me," she said. "They should," I told her. "Fear means you're thinking straight." She met my eyes. "When I crawled into that barn, I thought I was already dead." I nodded. So did I. Turns out we were both wrong. By the next evening, the stillness had settled in again, thicker than before. The horses stood uneasy in the corral. The air felt heavy, like the land was holding its breath. Nieli sat by the window as the light faded, her braid draped over one shoulder, a knife resting on the table beside her. I checked the rifle, then the gates, then the shadows along the road. Whatever was coming, it was close enough to taste. The morning broke in that uneasy way I'd felt before a fight still. Ere no bird calls the corral, quiet except for the soft snort of a restless mare. Nieli stood on the porch, her hair braided over one shoulder, a knife in her hand, and a strip of jerky in the other. "They're coming," she said, not as a guess, but as if she'd already seen them. I had the rifle cleaned and ready. The gates were barred, and the horses moved close to the house. The two of us didn't speak much as we waited. By midday, the sound of hooves rolled across the land. 3 riders came into view through the heat shimmer. Clyde Mercer led his bulk slouched in the saddle, Roy Cutter riding just behind him, eyes flicking from side to side. Aaron Tull brought up the rear, his badge catching the light. They stopped just inside the gate. Tull called out Carver, last chance to hand her over. I stepped into the yard, rifle down, but not far from ready. "She's under my roof," I said. "She's wanted," he shot back. "She's done nothing wrong," I told him. "Town doesn't want her here," he said. "I'm not in town," I answered. Roy's fingers twitched toward his holster. I lifted the rifle a hair, not aiming just enough to make the point. "Don't," I said. Nieli came down from the porch, then moving to stand beside me. Her chin was high, voice clear. "You want to take me?" she called. "Try." The heat pressed down as her words carried. Roy looked uneasy. Nieli stepped forward. "I've bled. I've run, and I've buried more than you ever will. If I fall, I'll take someone with me." Clyde's eyes narrowed, but his hands stayed still. I fixed my gaze on Tull. "You fire here, you'll stand before a judge explaining why a badge turned into a noose." His mouth tightened. "You think the law cares about her?" "No," I said. "That's why I do." Silence stretched until Roy muttered, "This ain't worth it." Tull glared his way, but Clyde shifted his reins and turned his horse. One after the other, they pulled back the dust, swallowing them as they rode out. We stayed where we were until the road was empty. Nieli let out a slow breath. "They'll be back," she said. I nodded. "Or worse, Will." She looked at me. "You didn't do it for justice." "No," I said. "I did it for you." She stepped into me, her arms sliding around my waist. I held her there, feeling the strength in her grip. That night the lamp stayed dark. We sat by the fire, our knees touching, her hands folded over mine. Outside the wind shifted, carrying the scent of mesquite and far-off rain. But I kept thinking of the dust cloud that would come again sooner or later. The summer heat settled over the land like a heavy blanket, pressing the days into long stretches of work and quiet. A week passed without the sound of hooves on the road or shadows along the ridge. I fixed the south fence, carved new posts under the shade of the porch, and kept the rifle within reach, though nothing stirred beyond the usual wind and jackrabbits. Nieli moved easily around the homestead now. Her limp had eased to a faint favoring of her right foot after long hours on her feet. She washed linens at the creek in the mornings, sometimes humming a tune I didn't know. And in the afternoons, she helped oil the saddles or tend the garden patch by the house. We spoke little about what had passed, but the air between us was steady, no longer edged with the expectation of departure. One morning I told her I was heading into Dry Bend. She was standing by the doorway, hands on her hips, hair pulled back and loose strands brushing her cheek. "I'm coming with you," she said. I studied her for a moment, then nodded. She wore a clean dress I'd traded for in Tucson blue cotton that hung just right at the waist and dipped low at the neckline. It wasn't stitched perfect, but it was hers. We rode side by side, passing the mesquite stands and the low, dry washes that led toward the main road. When we came into town, heads turned. Some folks watched us openly, others turned away quick. We rode past the saloon where Clyde sometimes stood, but he wasn't there. Tull didn't show his face either. At the mercantile, I bought nails and oil, while Nieli chose fabric for curtains, running the cloth between her fingers before settling on a soft, cream-colored bolt. Outside, a boy of about 10 stood near the hitch rail, staring up at Nieli. "Are you his wife?" he asked. I glanced at her. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away from me either. "She is," I said. The boy nodded satisfied and went back to tossing pebbles at a post. We left town without trouble. The ride home was quiet. The sun dropping lower, long shadows stretching over the road. Back at the ranch, we put the supplies away and sat on the porch. The stars began to show one by one, the air cooling just enough to ease the weight of the day. "You still hear them?" Nieli asked. "Who?" I said. "The ghosts." I looked out over the dark stretch of land. "Sometimes," I said. "But they don't feel as loud since you started making noise here." She reached over and took my hand. "Then let's keep making noise." The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of rain far to the south. I didn't know if trouble had truly passed or was only circling wider before it came back. But with her hand in mine, I knew we'd meet it standing together. The days that followed passed without a single rider on the horizon. The air carried the faint sweetness of mesquite bloom, and the creek, though low, kept running clear enough to fill the troughs. Nieli took to hanging the new curtains in the front room, her stitches uneven, but steady. I worked fence posts along the north line, the rhythm of the mallet and the creak of wire, the only sounds in the open heat. One afternoon, I came in to find her standing by the window in the blue dress from Tucson, the light behind her tracing the outline of her frame. She turned when she heard my boots on the floorboards. "I never thought I'd live like this," she said. I stepped closer. "You think it's going to end?" She shrugged. "I used to think everything ended. Now, I'm afraid it won't." I told her I wasn't a man for promises, but if she stayed, I'd build the life she wanted. She pressed her hand to my chest and said, "I already stayed." We rode into town together the next week. No one challenged us, and the few who watched kept their words behind tight mouths. At the store, she chose thread and flour. I picked up nails and lamp oil. On the way back, we stopped at the ridge where she'd first seen watchers on the road. The land lay quiet now, stretching to the far hills without a mark of movement. That evening, we sat on the porch with coffee cooling in our cups. The stars came out slow, one after another, as the air cooled and the earth gave up the heat of the day. She leaned into my shoulder and asked, "Do you still hear them?" I knew she meant the ghosts. "Not as loud," I said. "Not since you started making noise here." She smiled faintly. "Then we'll keep making noise. Out here, trouble never truly disappears." But I'd learned something in the weeks since she stepped into my house, that a man can fight for land, for his name, or for what's right, But the fight that matters most is for the people he lets inside his walls. Nieli had walked in wounded and wary. She'd stayed because she knew we'd face what came next together. And on the frontier, that's the closest thing to peace you can count on. If you've ever found a place or a person worth standing your ground for, you'll understand why some fights are worth the dust they kick up. I'd be interested to hear your story too.